with some of the uprisings of the 1960s as a result of racial frustrations. Now, until the 1960s, many white Americans mistakenly conceived of racism as just a Southern problem, convinced that Jim Crow only resided south of the Mason-Dixon line. But the racial uprisings of the 1960s throughout the country rudely awakened Americans, because almost all of those uprisings occurred in northern cities. And so you see in this map showing the location of race riots in the 1960s, and a majority of them were in the North. Now, although segregation was not the law in the North, most school systems in northern cities were not very well integrated because school assignment was usually linked to neighborhood. The residential patterns led to de facto segregation of school systems throughout the North. And because schools were funded by property taxes, white suburban schools had many more resources that were lacking in all Black inner city schools. And the federal government was complicit in segregating America and in creating all Black ghettos, both in the North and the South, because of the process known as redlining. As early as the 1930s, during the FDR administration, the Federal Housing Administration furthered segregation by refusing to insure mortgages in and near African-American neighborhoods. At the same time, the FHA was subsidizing builders who were mass producing entire subdivisions for whites, with the requirement that none of the homes were to be sold to African Americans. The FHA's justification was that if Blacks bought homes in these all-white suburbs, the property values of the white homes that the FHA was insuring, those property values would decline, and therefore FHA loans would be at risk. The term redlining comes from these color-coded maps used by federal, state, and city governments to indicate where it was safe to insure mortgages. And anywhere African Americans lived, well, those areas were colored red to indicate to appraisers that these neighborhoods were too risky to insure mortgages. And therefore, Blacks were kept from buying homes in white neighborhoods. And so redlining and other racist city planning policies transformed and left Black neighborhoods with fewer parks and trees. And the policy of redlining had three important long-term effects. It made it virtually impossible for Blacks to move out of inner cities that were rapidly decaying. Redlining also deprived African Americans of the opportunity to buy houses in the suburbs, and therefore they could not build equity from those investments. And redlining also had an environmental impact. Across more than 100 cities nationwide, a recent study found, formerly redlined neighborhoods were 5 degrees hotter on average today than areas that were not redlined. And a large part of that was because of the absence of parks and trees in redlined neighborhoods. In 1966, when Martin Luther King led a march against housing segregation in a white district in Chicago, he was met by hecklers waving Confederate flags and wearing Nazi-style helmets. When Black families succeeded in moving into white neighborhoods in northern cities, white people and white-owned businesses often fled to the suburbs, which left poor Blacks further quarantined in urban ghettos. An investigation into the urban riots of the 1960s, led by the Kerner Commission, concluded that our nation is moving towards two societies, one white, one black, separate and unequal. And the Kerner report concluded that white racism was the main cause of the uprisings in the 1960s. Specifically mentioned were pervasive discrimination and segregation, harsh conditions in ghettos, and frustration of hopes and a feeling of powerlessness on the part of many Blacks. The Kerner report urged the creation of jobs, job training programs, and decent housing for African Americans. The commission warned that unless conditions were remedied, the country faced a system of apartheid in its major cities. Apartheid, the system that was in place in South Africa at the time, was legally sanctioned separation of the races. Now, life today for African Americans in large cities is measurably better than it was in 1968 when the Kerner report came out. But some things haven't changed since then, notably police discrimination and violence directed at African Americans. Now we're going to take a look at race relations under Presidents Nixon through Trump. Richard Nixon's election in 1968 came on the heels of the racial disturbances that had exploded in American cities. And for many white Americans, the lessons of those riots was that sterner measures were needed to stop lawlessness and violence. Nixon's victory in 1968 signaled a white backlash against Black militancy, against student activism, and against the anti-Vietnam War protest. Nixon adopted a Southern strategy, which was a campaign that used fear of crime and lawlessness to tap into Southern opposition to racial integration and equality without using racial language. And so, according to the Southern strategy, Nixon promised to seek no new civil rights legislation. And Nixon maintained that the law must be colorblind. The Southern strategy also motivated Nixon to speak out against court-ordered busing. He said, "I am convinced that while legal segregation is totally wrong, forced integration of housing or education is just as wrong." Well, Nixon's call for law and order was a dog whistle, signaling his support for an end to protests, marches, and boycotts, while his war on drugs played on racialized fears about crime. It not only appealed to the racial resentments of many white Southerners, but Nixon's promise of law and order as a remedy to the chaos afflicting the nation's cities, that resonated with the so-called silent majority. That's a term that Vice President Agnew used to describe most Americans. Nixon's racism and bigotry are now very well established, largely due to the approximately 3,400 hours of secret recordings he made during his presidency. These recordings reveal that Nixon believed in a hierarchy of races, with white people at the top and people of African and Latin American descent towards the bottom. He tried to persuade Congress to prohibit forced busing as a way to desegregate schools. And he forbade the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare to cut off federal funds, or he encouraged the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare to cut off federal funds from school districts that complied with orders to integrate. In 1971, he launched the war on drugs. 23 years later, in 1994, John Ehrlichman, who was Nixon's assistant for domestic affairs, asserted that Nixon cynically adopted the war on drugs in order to target the anti-war left and to target Blacks. Ehrlichman said about this, he said, "We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or Blacks. But by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and Blacks with heroin, and then the criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did." This from John Ehrlichman in 1994. One of the most contentious racial issues during the Nixon presidency, as I mentioned, was court-ordered busing in order to achieve integration. Forced busing was mandated by the courts, mainly in large ethnically segregated school systems in many northern cities. From 1972 to 1980, despite court-ordered busing, the percentage of Blacks attending mostly minority schools barely changed. In 1972, 63.6% of Blacks were in segregated schools. 8 years later, in 1980, instead of 63.6, it was 63.3%. So court-ordered busing really had no impact on desegregating schools. And there were ugly protests against forced busing, particularly in Boston, one of America's most liberal cities. Their school buses carrying African-American children were pelted with eggs, bricks, and bottles, and police fought in combat gear to control angry white protesters who were besieging schools. Busing programs became voluntary in many communities following the passage of the General Education Provisions Act of 1974, which reversed court-ordered busing. It prohibited federally appropriated funds for busing. Now, Nixon was extremely concerned about the growth of Black militancy during his administration, and so he employed the FBI to destroy those organizations. The FBI harassed civil rights leaders even before Nixon was elected president. J. Edgar Hoover was convinced that the civil rights movement was aided and abetted by communists, and so he ordered surveillance and wiretapping of Black leaders, including Martin Luther King. FBI agents constantly hounded Dr. King, investigating his associates, compiling a massive dossier on him, and eventually trying to destroy him. When FBI agents discovered that King had been involved in sexual liaisons, they sent him the following letter, asking him to look into your heart. You know you are a complete fraud. King, like all frauds, your end is approaching. There is only one thing left for you to do. You know what that is. There is but one way out for you. You better take it before your filthy, abnormal, fraudulent self is bared to the nation. Clearly, this FBI letter was to encourage Martin Luther King to commit suicide. Suspicion lingers to this day as to whether the FBI had a hand in King's assassination. The FBI's campaign against Martin Luther King was part of a larger program called COINTELPRO, which is short for Counterintelligence Program. J. Edgar Hoover had directed all of the FBI bureau offices to, quote, expose, disrupt, misdirect, discredit, and otherwise neutralize African-American organizations and their leaders. During the Nixon presidency, the FBI used COINTELPRO to destroy the Black Panther Party, which Hoover described as the greatest threat to the internal security of the country. The FBI launched covert a covert effort to send anonymous letters to inflame rival factions of the Panthers against each other. And the FBI assisted the Chicago police to assassinate Panther leader Fred Hampton. This campaign was so successful that by the early 1980s, the Black Panther Party had all but dissolved. The Black Power movement, which lasted from 1965 to 75, dissipated because many of its leaders fell victim to the government's COINTEL program, which thoroughly infiltrated the Black Power movement. Many in mainstream white society viewed the Black Panthers and Black Power groups very negatively, dismissing them as violent, anti-white, and anti-law establishment enforcement. And even after the Black Power movement's decline in the late 1970s, its impact continued to be felt for generations to come. With its emphasis on Black racial identity, Black pride, and self-determination, Black Power had an enormous impact on Black communities. And its influence continues today with Black studies programs in universities and with the efforts of the Black Lives Matter movement to combat systemic institutionalized racism in America. There were some hopeful developments for African Americans in the 1970s. In 1972, Congress passed the Equal Employment Opportunity Act, which banned discrimination in the field of employment. One major Supreme Court decision was a mixed bag for the cause of civil rights. In 1974, Alan Baki, a 33-year-old white student, was rejected admission to the UC Davis Medical School. And he then sued because the university had set aside 16 admission slots for disadvantaged non-whites. 4 years later, in Regents of UC versus Baki, the court allowed Baki to be admitted, but it also permitted universities to take race into account in their admissions policies as long as race was not the decisive factor. Another positive development, in 1977, ABC television drew record-breaking audiences by airing a series based on Alex Haley's book, Roots, which had an immediate cultural impact. Its frank depiction of slavery led to conversations between Black and white Americans about previously taboo subjects. From the 1970s to 2000, Blacks won 13 congressional seats and were elected mayors to Los Angeles, Cleveland, Detroit, Chicago, New York, Newark, and Gary, Indiana. Ronald Reagan began his political career with his 1966 campaign for governor of California. In that campaign, he denounced the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. While running radio ads, these ads referred to urban areas as jungles. Regarding fair housing, Reagan said, if an individual wants to discriminate against Negroes or others in selling or renting his house, it is his right to do so. He joked publicly about Africans and cannibalism, and he verbally accosted an African-American protester in 1968 at the Republican National Convention. And like Nixon, he exploited racial issues to get elected. In his 1980 presidential campaign, he extended the Southern strategy of currying favor with anti-civil rights whites in the South. He deployed racially coded language like states' rights and law and order, and he invoked the image of the welfare queen, which he described as a Black woman having, quote, 80 names, 30 addresses, 12 social security cards, resulting in a tax-free income of $150,000. In fact, he was referring to a real person. Her name was Linda Taylor, and she was convicted of welfare fraud. Although hers was an uncommon case, Reagan repeated the racist trope of welfare queen at virtually every campaign stop in front of white audiences. In so doing, he portrayed racial minorities as undeserving takers, while ignoring the institutional racism at the heart of economic inequality. The message to white voters was that African Americans were to blame for their own standing in society, and that government programs aimed at alleviating racial inequalities would disadvantage white Americans. So this was a very different approach than Lyndon Johnson's Great Society. After securing the Republican nomination in 1980, Reagan launched his official campaign by delivering a major speech in Philadelphia, Mississippi, just 7 miles from where 3 civil rights workers had been murdered in 1964. That was yet another dog whistle to the 20,000 white people who were gathered there, many proudly waving Confederate flags. As president, Reagan pursued and implemented policies that disproportionately harmed and disadvantaged people of color. He supported tax cuts for the rich and cut social programs for middle and low-income families. He criticized food stamps, Medicaid, and federally funded legal services for the poor. He continued to employ racial imagery and racial references with allegations of, quote, the Cadillac driving welfare queen and strapping young bucks who fraudulently received food stamps to buy T-bone steaks. He refused to impose sanctions on the apartheid government of South Africa. In the early 1980s, a cheap, highly addictive form of cocaine known as crack was then plaguing the nation. The crack epidemic particularly devastated African-American communities by causing the increase of addictions, deaths, and drug-related crimes. Between 1984 and 1989, the homicide rate of Black males aged 14 to 17 more than doubled. In 1986, Reagan signed the Anti-Drug Abuse Act, which established mandatory minimum prison sentences for specific drug offenses. Part of the act provided for a minimum penalty of 5 years for possession of just 5 grams of crack cocaine. Whereas if you had powdered cocaine, which was used primarily by white drug abusers, you would have to have 500 grams in order to warrant that same 5-year sentence. So 5 grams of crack cocaine would give you a 5-year prison sentence. 500 grams of powdered cocaine would lead to the same sentence. Since approximately 80% of crack users were African American, these mandatory minimums led to an unequal increase of incarcerated rates of nonviolent Black drug offenders. And that devastated families and communities of Black and poor people of color. And it should be pointed out that this clearly racist law was supported by both Democrats and Republicans in Congress. Reagan's focus on criminal punishment rather than treatment led to massive increases of the jail population for nonviolent drug offenses. The prison population quadrupled between 1980 and 2000, due entirely to stiffer sentencing policies, not because of more crime. Between 1985 and 2000, drug offenses accounted for 2/3 of the spike in the inmate population. On the other hand, during the Reagan administration, Black unemployment fell by 9% during his presidency, and the number of Black-owned businesses increased by 38% during Reagan's 8 years in the White House. Although Reagan had opposed the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the 1965 Voting Rights Act, when he was president, he signed an extension of the Voting Rights Act for another 25 years. But if there was any question about Reagan's attitude on race, It was answered in a recently published report based on Nixon's tapes. In a phone conversation between Reagan and Nixon in October 1971, Reagan used disparaging remarks to refer to African nations represented at the UN. He said, "To see those monkeys from those African countries, damn them, they're still uncomfortable wearing shoes." And Reagan laughed when he said this to Nixon on the phone. Now we're going to take a look at the presidencies of the first George Bush and Bill Clinton. The first President Bush had a mixed and complicated legacy when it came to race. He wanted to see himself as being devoid of racism, but the reality is that Bush often had to do dog whistles and appeal to less enlightened Americans on race. To many Americans, the Willie Horton ad is an indelible strain on Bush's reputation. The TV spot about the Massachusetts inmate was produced by Bush supporters, particularly Lee Atwater. And this was during Bush's 1988 presidential campaign, accusing Massachusetts Governor Michael Dukakis of granting a weekend pass to Willie Horton, who then committed murder as a result of that weekend pass. The ad was widely condemned as racist and is still regarded 4 decades later as one of the most extreme attack ads in modern political history. Once George Herbert Walker Bush was elected, he elevated African Americans to high public office. He nominated Colin Powell, who last week passed away, to the top post in the US military. Powell went on to become the first Black Secretary of State under the administration of Bush's son, George W. Bush. In 1991, the first Bush president nominated Clarence Thomas to replace the retiring Thurgood Marshall, who had been the first African-American on the Supreme Court. Now, Clarence Thomas was the ideological opposite of Thurgood Marshall. Marshall was a civil rights legend who argued the Brown versus Board of Ed case that struck down school segregation. Clarence Thomas, who is currently the longest serving member on the High Court, has ruled against affirmative action and voted to end key protections in the Voting Rights Act. But it should also be pointed out that Joe Biden was the chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, and he voted in favor of Thomas's appointment to the court. You may remember that's when Anita Hill charged sexual harassment against Thomas. Now, while African Americans continued to make social and political gains during the 1980s, the ugly specter of racial violence was never far from the surface. In December 1986, a Black man was murdered and another was severely beaten by gangs of whites in Howard Beach, Queens, in New York. 3 years later, 4 Blacks were assailed by 30 whites in Bensonhurst, Brooklyn, and that resulted in the killing of a 16-year-old African American. In 1991, again in Bensonhurst, a man stabbed Reverend Al Sharpton as he led a march through a neighborhood to protest the killing of the 16-year-old. On Labor Day in 1989, race riots erupted in the vacation town of Virginia Beach. And in March of 1991, Rodney King was brutally beaten by 4 police officers, while 11 other policemen stood by and watched. And that was followed by the LA riots. Now, Republicans had occupied the White House for 20 of the 24 years between 1968 and 1992. So there was only one Democratic president between 68 and 72, and that was Jimmy Carter, and he served for only 1 term. So by the early 1990s, the Democratic Party felt it was losing its appeal on the national level because of the backlash against the social programs of the Lyndon Johnson years in the 1960s. And so some Democrats felt the party needed to distance itself from civil rights activists, from outspoken Black political leaders like Al Sharpton and Jesse Jackson. The Democrat who broke the party's presidential losing streak was Bill Clinton, and he adopted many of the recommendations to distance the Democratic Party from civil rights activists. Clinton was very popular among African Americans. Some called him America's first Black president. But despite that, Clinton took every opportunity to show that he would not be beholden to the interests of Black Americans. Despite having the most diverse administration of any American president, Clinton slashed welfare payments. He funneled billions to prisons and law enforcement as part of the war on crime. And as a result of this, welfare reform led to an increase in extreme poverty, families that were disproportionately minority households. And in 1994, Congress passed a crime bill with its 3-strike provisions, and that led to a skyrocketing increase in imprisonment, as you can see, in this chart, which shows incarceration rates in America from 1926 to 2010. And so this shows the prison admission rate for whites, and this line is for Blacks. But notice the spike that occurs right around here, and that is 1994, when this crime bill went into effect. And with this skyrocket in increased imprisonment, Black men were 6 times as likely to be incarcerated as white men. This is one of the legacies of the Clinton administration. Now, the second President Bush did little to resolve racial problems. He opposed so-called racial preferences used in admission process at the University of Michigan, and he shamefully delayed aid to victims of Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans. When Barack Obama was elected as the nation's first Black president in 2008, some proclaimed his election to be the start of a post-racial society, meaning that with the election of a Black president, racism was now a thing of the past in the United States. Yet, Obama's presidency did not usher in racial harmony. Rather, both Blacks and whites believed that race relations deteriorated during Obama's 8 years as president, according to public opinion polls. The killings of Trayvon Martin in Florida and Michael Brown in St. Louis, the death of Freddie Gray in Baltimore while in police custody, the massacre of 9 Black worshipers by a white man at a South Carolina church, all of these stood as examples of how racism remained problematic during the Obama presidency. Mounting tensions over police shootings of African Americans prompted protests in several cities, and that led to the emergence of the Black Lives Matter movement. When Obama first entered the White House, a New York Times CBS News poll found that, I'm having a little difficulty here. I don't know why I'm, let's see. Okay, let me try this. Okay, so this, in 2009, the pollsters asked the question, are race relations good or bad? In 2009, 65% of Americans polled said that race relations were good. This is when Obama entered the White House. 8 years later, 69% said that race relations were bad. So you can see the change during Obama's 8 years in office. Now, Donald Trump, let's see if I can make this bigger. No, for some reason, okay, we'll have to go with this. Donald Trump repeatedly claimed that he was the least racist person, but his record suggests otherwise. The very first time Trump appeared on the pages of the New York Times back in the 1970s was when the United States Department of Justice sued him for racial discrimination in refusing to rent to Black Americans in the properties that he owned. Trump called for the death penalty against the Central Park Five. These were 5 young teenagers of color who were accused of raping the Central Park jogger. And even though they were later exonerated on the basis of DNA evidence, decades later, when Trump ran for president, he still maintained that the Central Park Five were guilty. As president, Donald Trump repeatedly claimed to have done more for Black Americans than anyone, with the possible exception of Abraham Lincoln. Well, that was quite a claim. He boasted, let's see if I can do this again. No. So Trump boasted that African-American unemployment dropped to record lows under his watch, and that is true. That was before the corona pandemic ravaged the economy. Trump heralded his administration's criminal justice overhaul for shortening mandatory minimum sentences for nonviolent drug offenders. And that led to the release of thousands of incarcerated people, mostly Black Americans. Trump also relished the fact that he increased funding for historically Black colleges and universities. And while all of that is true, Trump's legacy when it comes to race is that in his 4 years as president, he used race as a weapon, claiming that, claiming without evidence that Barack Obama wasn't born in the United States, saying that Mexican immigrants were bringing crime and were rapists, arguing that there were very fine people on both sides after the violence at the white supremacist rally in Charlottesville, which left 1 counter-protester dead. He questioned why the United States would accept more immigrants from Haiti and shithole countries in Africa rather than from places like Norway. At times he used racist language or dog whistles and repeatedly failed to denounce white supremacy. And many of his policies reflected his racist rhetoric. He put an end to racial sensitivity training in federal offices. He halted consent decrees that were intended to end racism in police departments. He attacked the New York Times 1619 Project, which represented a thorough history of slavery in America. Trump claimed it was anti-American. He depicted the largely peaceful protests for racial justice across the country as violent riots. And he appointed hundreds of appeals court judges, not a single one of them white. And he ignited the fight over critical race theory in schools, claiming that it amounted to psychological abuse and brainwashing. So I'd like to finish these 4 lectures focusing on the controversy over critical race theory. It has become a catch-all for all of the history that makes white parents uncomfortable. Those who raise critical race theory as a red flag are opposed to teaching an accurate history of this country. The topic of critical race theory has exploded in the public arena starting this past spring, especially in K through 12 schools, where numerous state legislatures are debating bills to ban critical race theory in classrooms. School boards, superintendents, even principals and teachers have had to confront questions about critical race theory. Across the country, enraged parents have protested critical race theory at school board meetings. In more than a dozen states, legislators have proposed bills to ban the teaching of critical race theory. So here is a map showing states that have proposed legislation to ban anti-racist teachings and trainings. And all those in this pink color represents states where teaching critical race theory is banned from schools. In blue, in Arizona, Arizona has banned state government programs that use critical race theory. And those in the maroon color are schools and state government bans on critical race theory. So, what exactly is critical race theory? Why has it become such a flashpoint in the culture wars taking place across the country today? Well, critical race theory was really an obscure concept developed in the late 1970s. But then Trump elevated it in order to attack it. Critical race theory began when scholars questioned why was it that after decades of civil rights reforms, why did schools remain segregated? Why were there still marked disparities between white and black wealth, between white and black home ownership? Why are unarmed blacks continued to be targeted disproportionately by police? Why has the achievement gap between black and white students remained as wide as it was in 1954? And why are states restricting voting rights in African-American districts? So the scholars concluded that legal remedies like the Civil Rights Act of 1964, these were ineffective against racism. That racism is pervasive. It's baked into the foundation of the American legal system and in American institutions as a whole. And the scholars also concluded that institutionalized racism perpetuates a caste system that relegates people of color to the bottom levels of society. They concluded that racism is systemic. It's inherent in much of the American way of life, that it goes beyond remedies from the Supreme Court or from individuals. It's ingrained in law and in almost all institutions in the United States. And so proponents of critical race theory cite as evidence funding inequities between white suburban schools and inner city schools, unequal access to jobs, housing, and healthcare, the reluctance of banks to extend mortgages to people of color, and with the practice of redlining to prevent blacks and other minorities from buying homes in specific neighborhoods, to a criminal justice system that discriminates against particular racial groups. But the fact is that critical race theory is a framework that is taught almost exclusively in graduate schools, in law schools, not in K through 12 education. Now, while some school district officials have issued mission statements, resolutions, or have spoken about changes in their policies using some of the discourse of critical race theory, it's not clear to what degree teachers are explicitly teaching the concepts of critical race theory, or the degree to which they use curriculum materials that are drawn from a critical race theory agenda. Nevertheless, opponents have used the phrase critical race theory to mean any instruction about the role of race in America, past or present. For those on the political right, critical race theory has come to stand for any teaching that challenges the narrative of America as a democratic, fair, and colorblind society, a society that promotes equal justice for all. For those on the political right, critical race theory is discomforting because it unravels and exposes the myth of equality and justice for all. Many conservatives maintain that critical race theory is divisive, as illustrated by this cartoon. They accuse the left of using critical race theory to indoctrinate children with the belief that the United States is inherently evil. Progressives, on the other hand, charge that critical race theory has been misunderstood and that it has been distorted. They claim it has become a dog whistle for those opposed to racial justice. Progressives believe white people should be pushed to confront systemic racism and white privilege in America, whereas conservatives see those initiatives as painting all white people as racist. The debate over critical race theory goes to the very heart of the theme of these 4 lectures on the problem of race in America. There will always be disagreement about any nation's history, and the United States is no exception. But to gloss over America's racist past, to legislate against the teaching of negative aspects of our history, well, that violates the shared vision of America as a nation that is open to a free and vigorous debate about its past. While such topics may make people feel guilty, angry, shameful, an American history curriculum without looking at the racist past is an invalid history. We should not try to avoid uncomfortable truths. To do otherwise is to cater to white fragility that keeps us from collectively confronting racism and the complex legacy of slavery. So that concludes these lectures on the